Good afternoon, and welcome to today's session of the Open Government in Action, Emerging Practices and Participatory Algorithmic Design. This session will be open to the public and is being recorded. A copy of who attended the event, as well as the agenda and notes, will all be posted publicly on the open.usa.gov website. My name is Daniel York, and I serve as the director of the U.S. Open Government Secretariat, housed under the U.S. General Services Administration. The United States established Secretariat in September 2023, so almost a year ago, to lead and oversee the domestic implementation of our membership in the Global Open Government Partnership, a voluntary global alliance between governments and civil society to bolster democracy through openness, transparency, and public engagement. The U.S. Secretariat leads the domestic OGP processes and development of the U.S. Open Government National Action Plans, conducts engagement sessions like this here today with U.S. civil society members, as well as members of federal, state, and local governments, and it actively collaborates with the American public on all open government themes. In this vein, we're very pleased to be co-hosting today's event with the White House's Office of Science, Technology Policy and the U.S. Tech Policy Network as a part of our ongoing public series on advancing open government work, including public engagement participation across the United States. We are very grateful to have our expert panelists and all of you joining us here today. And a reminder, the session is being recorded and again will be made available. And with that, I'd like to turn over to Jennifer Anderson-Lewis, who serves as a senior advisor for the Open Government and Tech Policy at the White House, and who leads efforts on mainstream open government principles at federal, state, local, tribal levels. Jen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, and a special thank you to our friends at the U.S. Open Government Secretariat for hosting today's virtual platform. I'm really thrilled to welcome you today and to serve as the overall moderator for today's session, which seeks to unpack the emerging practice of participatory algorithmic design, or the use of public participation and community engagement in the scoping, design, and implementation of public sector algorithms. For those of you in the tech and data space, including our peers and our innovators at the state and local level, you know well the significance and the promise of machine learning and algorithmic tools in delivering for your communities. These are tools that are increasingly finding their way into all aspects of American life, from the ways in which students are directed to schools to the ways in which health services are distributed. AI increasingly has the power to transform the way our public needs are identified and the ways in which they are delivered. For those of you in the open government space, you know well that participatory and inclusive technological tools are required to not just ensure effective public service delivery, but to bolster democratic dividends, primarily community trust. We will begin today's session with a technical exchange, highlighting some pioneering efforts and experiences by leaders at the city, country, and federal level in implementing participatory algorithmic design. We encourage you to listen and learn, as we are doing at the federal level, and engage in the Q&A that will follow the exchange. We will then move into a moderated panel to discuss and explore evidence, research, and emerging practices, both nationally and globally, in participatory algorithm design. And finally, today's session will conclude with remarks and reflections by the White House OSTP's Principal Deputy Chief Technology Officer, Deirdre Mulligan. We are thrilled to be hosting this stellar lineup of practitioners and experts for today's event, which represent a diversity of regions, levels of government, and institutions across this country. We are also so pleased to be joined by our partners at the Global Open Government Partnership to share comparative experiences across countries. We really hope you enjoy today's event. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass this over to my colleague and co-founder of the U.S. Tech Policy Network, Shannon Arvisu, who also serves as Senior Advisor to the Chief Data Officer at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Shannon, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jen, and allow me to add my welcome on behalf of the U.S. Tech Policy Network, which was launched earlier this year by GSA and White House OSTP to provide a durable conduit between federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial levels on tech and data policy. I'm pleased to serve as the moderator of this technical exchange, which features groundbreaking efforts in participatory algorithmic design across the cities of San Jose, California, and San Antonio, Texas, from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and from the U.S. Census Bureau. We'll start with some brief presentations from each of our panelists, and then move to a moderated Q&A. And I'm pleased to be joined today by Chelsea Palacio, who is the Public Information Officer for the City of San Jose, California. And in this role, she develops, designs, and implements strategic communications, outreach, and community stakeholder engagement plans for city IT programs in 4 languages, including 311 services and responsible utilization of artificial intelligence. Our second presentation today will be by Erin Dalton, who is the director of the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, which works to strengthen families and communities through a network of social services, care, and support. Also joining us is Emily Royale, who serves as the Smart City Administrator at the Information Technology Services Department at the City of San Antonio, Texas, where she manages a community-driven framework to shape the city's investments in emerging technology for delivering public services. Emily also serves as the chair of the Cooperative Purchasing Committee of the GovAI Coalition and as vice chair for United for Smart and Sustainable Communities, a joint initiative of the UN Habitat and ITU. And last but not least, we are joined by Michael Hawes, who serves as a senior advisor for data access and privacy for the U.S. Census Bureau, where he is responsible for outreach and engagement with the Census Bureau's data users on issues relating to the impact of privacy protection methodologies on the accessibility and usability of census data. Welcome to you all, and with that, I will hand this over to Chelsea.
Thank you, Shannon. So again, I'm Chelsea Palacio, and I am the Public Information Officer for the City of San Jose IT Department. So participatory algorithmic design. It's a technical way to say that the public is not only engaged, but involved in the process of the design and implementation of new technologies. The City of San Jose has been learning to integrate this idea into how we introduce new technologies for city services like AI-based sensing technologies. As we implement these technologies, including automated license plate readers or ALPRs and AI gunshot detection, initially public perception was not ideal. Initial perceptions refer to the city as a big brother, that the city is always watching, and AI is a, quote, privacy nightmare. The city saw a critical need to expand public involvement in order to proceed with AI technologies in a responsible way. And so far, we are seeing a more collaborative relationship with the public. As San Jose continues to establish working partnerships with the community, residents are actively engaging to inform direction of the city's AI implementation, like asking for the city to install more ALPRs to make neighborhoods safer, and how the city should use AI to make other city services more efficient. For participatory algorithmic design, public engagement is key. It is important to open up the process so the community can be involved at the level they are most comfortable speaking to, whether it be sharing technical feedback on algorithmic design or more general feedback on how the city uses technology. While implementing ALPRs and gunshot detection, San Jose hosted public meetings in our Project Hope communities, which represent underserved areas stressed by crime, blight, and violence. Meetings were presented in multiple languages to ensure that residents could speak freely and provide input and direction without language barriers. To increase accountability and transparency, the city publishes feedback as well as our data usage reports on our website. San Jose is also exploring AI object detection, where we are actively engaging our communities to guide the scope on how the technology is being trained and potentially used in our city services. Engagement has already provided direction on what objects the city will train AI to detect, as well as using that feedback, which has so far shifted the focus of our pilot to specific road conditions and hazards, like potholes and illegal dumping, to increase safety of motorists and pedestrians on our streets. Next slide, please. So here you see a little bit of the before and after of our exploration of participatory algorithmic design. In the media, as well as from public engagement, we see people are confused with why are we using technology if they haven't done anything yet, the privacy nightmare quotes, as well as when it comes to after, people are fighting to actually have these devices in their neighborhoods. Next slide. So participatory algorithmic design is creating a positive cultural shift of how government works, planning public engagement from the start, ensuring meetings are communicated with enough notice for residents to attend, reducing language and accessibility barriers, and providing follow-up to our residents to encourage ongoing engagement. This proactive approach is increasing trust and transparency in the city of San Jose. The focus on public engagement promotes all voices to be heard from the start, resulting in staff and residents strengthening our city together. Next slide, please. So this completes my case study, and I'm excited to pass it on to Erin Dalton from Allegheny County.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So just a little bit about the Department of Human Services. We're responsible for child protection amongst a bunch of other important topics in human services. And so we have responsibility to work with and support our most vulnerable residents. Next slide, please. And we have amazing integrated data. So I just wanted to make sure folks were aware of that as we began. Next slide. So I wanted to focus on Hello Baby as the use case for this work. And so we didn't set out to do the best participatory design of an algorithm, in the world. What we set out to do is to solve a very real human services problem. And you can see that on the screen, right? So in over half of the cases where a child died or nearly died as a result of abuse or neglect in our county, there had not been a child welfare referral prior to that critical incident. That meant that we had really no opportunity to help support the family prior to the incident, and that's what we wanted to do. Next slide. And it's not unique to Allegheny County. Across the country and the world, we're really trying to flip the paradigm on prevention, really prevent abuse and neglect and support families early. But primarily what researchers and practitioners around the world have been paying attention to is what are those interventions? What do you give people to help bend the curve, whether that's nurse-family partnership or other home visiting or direct aid? But we really sought to pay attention to, first and foremost, who do you give that to, right? So if we can acknowledge that an identical program that is delivered to parents with double the risks has twice the effect, then you really need to be able to target and identify early those that have the highest adversities. And traditional programs just don't do a very good job at identifying those highest need families. They serve people all over the map, not just the highest risk. Next slide, please. So we, with partners, set out to build a model that did a great job of identifying those most vulnerable. Here are some of the factors and things that we predicted, really using the language of adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. And we did what is relatively the easy thing, right? We built a model that could identify out of all babies born in Allegheny County, who's the most vulnerable. And then we sought to provide supports not just to the highest risk to all families, but to tier those supports to those at moderate and high risk, to use our resources for those most vulnerable. So you can see, we had 23 times the likelihood of a home removal and 10 times the likelihood of experiencing a post-neonatal infant mortality. Next slide. So that's Hello Baby, right? So we built a better model to identify people to families to reach out to and offer those kind of tiered supports that I mentioned ever so briefly. What this means is that we had to get community consent to risk score every single baby born in Allegheny County, whether that's my child or any other child. Next slide. So really, if you want to be able to do, I don't know, at least on my screen, that's not coming out so great. But if you want to be able to do this sort of work, you've got to have a strong process in place and be sort of granted social license. So we've been at this for a long time. We did the kinds of things on the screen, including funding independent ethical review, getting stakeholder input, competitive procurement, strong evaluation. But we did a number of other very special things to kind of get us social approval, social license to proceed. Amongst those, and I'll just be brief, one of the most important, I think, was doing case reviews with families and with practitioners who were given the de-identified examples of people who were the highest need, right? And everyone really agreed across those scenarios that we really should intervene with people, and they gave us insights into what would be helpful. We also partnered with researchers, giving them access to our community to ask our family members and people in community what was most important to them. And no surprise, a lot of what they told those researchers and us was that it mattered more what we gave to people and how we approached people than maybe how we got to their door. And then I'll just say the last two things. One, I think it is really important for government officials to have the big meeting, right? It's difficult to stand in front of 100 people plus and make a stake for why this is important. I think that's critical. And then I think it's also important that we're willing to make changes, and we made changes both to the algorithm and to the intervention. All right, that's a very brief bit about Hello Baby. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Royal from San Antonio.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Royal. I am the Smart Cities Administrator for the City of San Antonio. I manage our Smart Cities program and division. Next slide, please. So I want to flag that when I was asked by Jen Lewis to identify a case study for participatory algorithms, I looked closely at some of the projects we've executed under our Smart Cities Roadmap and our Smarter Together initiative. We prototype and test emerging technologies and evaluate them for their capabilities to address business needs for the City of San Antonio. And we do that through a community-driven, people-centered framework. You can visit smartertogethersa.com to check out all the awesome work under the Smart Cities Roadmap, this project being one of them. Next slide, please. So the business case for this problem, and we always set out our business cases first rather than looking at specific technologies to pilot. We had a serious issue with communications around construction related to various bond packages that we had introduced in 2017 that were being carried out through 2024. We had several small businesses that were impacted across corridors, as you can see to your right, that were under major construction. And we really lacked an easy 24/7 updated way and method to communicate with our residents and small business owners and our visitors to some of these major corridors about construction, road closures, and really provide that real-time information about upcoming road closures and challenges they may experience navigating this particular area of town. Those pain points increased over time. And as you can see, we started getting some negative Twitter reactions to the lack of communication about construction in downtown San Antonio. Next slide, please. So to fix this problem, we introduced an AI-powered chatbot. We partnered with a company called Hello Lamppost. And really what the chatbot is intended to do is provide interactive, up-to-date, 24/7 information to people visiting our Broadway corridor, to residents that were interested in the bond project, and also to our business owners that were impacted by those bond projects. We identified about 120 businesses that would be impacted by the use of this tool, and we provided signage at about 40 locations along this corridor as part of a pilot to test and evaluate the capabilities of AI to provide this real-time information to the public. Next slide, please. The way the system works is that through either digital means or by scanning a QR code that is physically located at the area of construction or in small businesses themselves, you can scan that code and access the chatbot through SMS or through an actual mobile app that you don't have to download. It's live in the browser, and begin talking. And the AI will respond and answer your questions accordingly. This was huge because previously we had in-person meetings that were provided by our Public Works Department for small businesses. We got counts of maybe 8 to 10 people joining those meetings weekly in person. And we were able to increase that traction of communication and reach to about 829 conversations over time and resulting in about 3,000, almost 3,500 messages. Next slide, please. Now, while there's a lot of efficiency and excitement around being able to provide these kinds of services with tools like AI, there are some significant drawbacks. In our initial release of this tool, the system hallucinated. And in one particular case, a user asked, where do I go if I have any questions about upcoming construction? And the AI actually responded, you should call our mayor directly and scan the live web to provide information about how to get in touch with our mayor. That is not the kind of solution we were looking for. And so we realized really early on that we needed to prevent the AI from accessing the web directly. But more importantly, we needed to dive much deeper into prompt engineering in order to set those boundaries and restrictions around how the AI could respond and provide those accurate responses to our residents. Next slide, please. So rather than shutting down the project and retracting the project, we instead pivoted towards what we would call a public prompt engineering model. And this is where we essentially invited the public to test the AI system with us. We turned off the AI tool, we created a sandbox environment for testing, and then we brought that AI chatbot to public events. We invited the public to come on site. We activated local businesses along our Broadway corridor to be the site of public testing around artificial intelligence technology. And we identified all kinds of nuances to really help us redesign this chatbot to be more responsive to the needs of our residents and more accurate. Next slide, please. And in my final slide, I just want to highlight, some key takeaways for the consideration of the group today. First of all, I think there is a misunderstanding about how cities are developing these AI systems. Typically, we're not building them in-house. Rather, we're procuring them and partnering with vendors in order to purchase these technologies and deliver them as public services. As a consequence of that, it's very important for us to have vendors that are willing to open the black box, if you will, and allow us to partner with them and collaborate with them by looking under the hood of these technologies and being transparent with us about how these AI systems work and are engineered so that we can inform and influence them to be more responsive to our unique conditions on the ground. I also want to flag that prompt engineering is really critical to developing services that are responsive and realistic to the unique contexts in which they operate. And that requires a lot of investment and time on behalf of cities to be able to provide that subject matter expertise in order to do that. And finally, something we learned from this project is that public testing is critical to build these robust services, certainly if they're going to be invested in the long term. But I do believe that should occur regardless of the technology that we're exploring. So in this case, it is artificial intelligence, but arguably any emerging technology is one in which we should integrate public feedback and perspective into its development. Thank you very much. And I will pass that on to Michael Hawes with the U.S. Census Bureau.
Thank you so much, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Michael Hawes. I'm a senior statistician for scientific communication at the U.S. Census Bureau, and I'm going to speak to you briefly about the critical role that stakeholder participation and engagement had in the design and implementation of the algorithms behind the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System, the system that we use to protect the confidentiality of 2020 Census data when we developed our statistical products. Next slide, please. So the U.S. Census Bureau, like our peer statistical agencies around the world, has a dual mandate to produce quality statistics about the nation's people and economy, while also protecting the confidentiality of the information entrusted to us by those who fill out our censuses and surveys. Now, unfortunately, that kind of dual mandate is made rather challenging by what I call the triple trade-off of official statistics. And this kind of essentially boils down to the fact that the more statistics you publish, and the greater the granularity and accuracy of those statistics that you're publishing, the greater the disclosure risk, the greater the confidentiality threat of those statistics. And any statistical technique that you could use to protect confidentiality in the data that you want to publish and release imposes a fundamental trade-off between the degree of data protection on the one hand and the resulting availability and accuracy of the statistics that you want to release on the others. So you have this three-dimensional trade-off here. Next slide, please. And with these kind of three finite commodities, the protection of the data, the accuracy of the data, and the quantity of the data that you want to release, You can maximize on any two of those three dimensions, but only at a really profound cost to the third. And so there are some rather difficult choices and decisions that agencies have to make when kind of deciding, okay, how much protection is enough, how much accuracy is enough, how many statistics do I want to be releasing? Because these are all three interrelated. Next slide, please. Now, as we were kind of approaching the 2020 census, we realized that the confidentiality protections that we had been using for the prior censuses, particularly the mechanisms that we used from 1990 until 2010, were becoming increasingly insufficient to counter the much more kind of vexing confidentiality threats of today, with the proliferation of third-party data and with much more powerful machine learning algorithms that could leverage that third-party data in an attack on what we were seeking to publish. So we decided to develop a new approach for disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census, and the system that we built is kind of predicated on this mathematical framework known as differential privacy. Differential privacy is kind of like a privacy risk accounting system, if you will. And the way this works is like every individual that's reflected in a particular statistic contributes towards that statistic's value. And every statistic that you publish is going to reveal or leak a small amount of private information in the process. Differential privacy as this kind of accounting, this risk accounting framework, allows you to assess each individual's contribution to each statistic, and then through noise infusion to essentially limit how much private information about them will leak in the process. Next slide, please. Now, all disclosure avoidance methods, as I mentioned before, and the parameters of their implementation impact the resulting fitness for use of the data in very different ways. And agencies have to be very careful and deliberate in their selection and implementation of disclosure avoidance methods to ensure that the resulting statistical products that we're releasing meet the needs of our data users, meet those priority use cases. And that requires subject matter expertise, it requires substantial research and evaluation, but most importantly, and most importantly for today's conversation, it requires stakeholder communication and engagement. Next slide, please. So in the context of the 2020 Census Disclosure Avoidance System, one of the primary algorithms that we use to protect confidentiality in our data is known as the top-down algorithm. And I'm not going to go into the technical details of that. I could spend an entire afternoon doing that, but I do have a link here to a technical paper if you're interested. But I'm going to highlight there's one stage in the middle of the algorithm. It's called the noisy measurement stage. And this is really the heart of the confidentiality protections themselves. And during that noisy measurement stage, we're essentially taking the confidential 2020 census data and we're asking a whole lot of questions about it. We're saying, how many people with this combination of characteristics live in this particular area? How many people with that combination of characteristics live in that area? And we're asking this trillions and trillions of times. And to each result of those questions that we're asking, we're injecting or infusing a little bit of statistical noise or uncertainty into the result. So if the actual confidential count was 3 people have this combination of characteristics in a particular census block, well, the result that you would get might be 3, it might be 2, it might be 4. But we're asking this trillions of times, and that is how we're protecting confidentiality. Next slide, please. The issue is, I mentioned differential privacy is this accounting framework. Well, the parameters of how you design and implement your algorithms here are going to determine that triple trade-off that I mentioned before. And those parameters, the kind of dials of kind of your implementation about deciding how much protection, how much accuracy is all governed in the context of differential privacy through a parameter known as your privacy loss budget. Your privacy loss budget kind of governs at the macro level of just how accurate and just how protected the resulting statistics are going to be. And then much like a monetary budget, your privacy loss budget, you allocate to different queries that you're asking. The more privacy loss budget you allocate to a particular query, the more accurate that resulting statistic is going to be. The less privacy loss budget you allocate to that query, the more protected the statistic will be, but the more noisy, the more error will be built into that statistic. And there's no right or wrong set of allocations. Essentially, you could allocate these privacy loss budget shares in very different ways, and you would get very different kind of resulting fitness for use. So you might be privileging certain use cases over others, or making certain statistics more accurate at the cost of accuracy for others. And this was where kind of stakeholder engagement and participation in our decision-making and design was critically important. So over the 4 years between 2019 and 2023, we, the Census Bureau, released 8 sets of what we call demonstration data, where we essentially ran 2010 census data through various iterations of our algorithms, and then allowed people to kind of play with the resulting protected statistics to see, would these meet my use cases? Would these meet my needs if this was done with the 2020 census data? And after each round, we got lots of feedback back from the public, and we used that feedback to tweak these allocations to improve the design of our algorithms. And the result was the set of parameter settings and algorithmic design that we used to actually protect the 2020 census. And with that, I believe I am at time. So next slide, and I'll hand things back to Shannon. Thank you so very much.
Thank you all. I'd like to invite all of the panelists to bring their video back on. And while they're doing that, I'd also like to invite folks listening in, please send in your questions in the chat. We'll be turning our attention to audience-generated questions in just a moment. But before then, I wanted to ask each of our panelists, based on your experience, what worked best so far, and what might you do differently in the future? So Emily, I see you are here present, so I'll pass it on over to you first.
Sure. Thanks, Shannon. Well, I think, for the city of San Antonio, what's worked best for us is probably a confluence of a couple factors when it comes to AI and algorithmic projects in particular. One certainly is the integration of the public perspective, especially for anything public facing. To elaborate a little bit on lessons learned from our public testing, we discovered things like, our Spanish users, for example, had to navigate a couple English questions before they were able to indicate that they wanted the conversation to take place in Spanish. Some of these basic UX types of information. But secondly, really having a vendor that was able and willing to be transparent with us about the process of prompt engineering. So the vendor that we worked with, Hello Lamppost, was very open to us providing feedback in terms of what we were hearing through public testing, and collaborate together to really re-engineer the algorithm to respond accordingly on the back end. That process was critical to the success of this project in particular. And I believe the outcome was a chatbot that really was more responsive, and the opportunity for us to be able to receive all of the data on the back end of that to discover and uncover where people were asking questions that the bot wasn't able to respond to effectively, log that, analyze that in partnership with a transparent vendor that was providing us with the access to all of that data and information.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Erin, Chelsea, would you like to chime in here?
Sure, I'll go ahead. Yeah, I mean, the Hello Baby example is a little bit different, right? And that the consequences and stakes are super high to either identifying people for supports or people's kind of worst nightmares around identifying people for other purposes. One of the things that we took a lot of time with, but I don't think it had a ton of value in the end, was really working through technical aspects of the model with participants, potential participants, family members, community, trying to, developing, for example, slim models that were smaller, that were theoretically easier to understand, when that wasn't really at the heart of what people really told us were their concerns, right? So a lot of us in this work, I think a lot of it's about the modeling itself, and that if we just make it easier to understand, that will solve some of the problems. That wasn't our experience with our community. Mostly they were concerned with what they might benefit from the service of being identified early and being supported, what they could be concerned about and how we were going to mitigate that, how people would treat them as human beings, and so on. And so while I think that work was really interesting, I don't think in our particular case generated any additional kind of trust or understanding of the approach, at least for the people that we talked to. So wanted to share that.
It's really interesting. Could you share what were some of the things that you heard were most important for them to provide input on, or things that they were most concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, people said things which you wouldn't be surprised that said, sort of people come to our door all the time, or they offer us things. We don't so much care, if you will, how you get to the door. What we care about is how you treat us when you get there and what you're going to do to support us. If you're offering us something that we don't need, then that's not going to be helpful. But things like diapers would be really helpful, meals for new parents, and when we were able to make good on the things that people wanted, and I think treat people with the respect that they deserve at that place, that was really what was of interest to them.
Thank you. Chelsea, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think for the city of San Jose, what really benefited us was that we worked with a lot of nonprofit organizations within our community who had already built that trust with residents and community members. So partnering up with those organizations allowed the city to come in and really provide answers to those big questions that allowed us to build trust through a city lens as well. And with those nonprofit organizations, we were really able to know exactly what languages were needed for those community meetings to provide the interpreters that we needed. So if it was going to be predominantly Spanish speakers, we had a Spanish interpreter. If it was Vietnamese, providing Vietnamese interpretation, to really allow people to provide feedback in the language that they're most comfortable with, which allows them to speak at ease and speak exactly what's on their mind without having that language barrier. Something that also really that continues to be a challenge is that having a lot of public meetings can be hard for timing, scheduling, and budget. Well, government employees, we work throughout the day. A lot of people in the community are working those same time frames. So being able to schedule those meetings outside of regular working hours so people can join meetings after work, virtually, in person, making sure we're in those communities, as well as how could we help them participate? So if they need childcare, how can we incorporate childcare so that they can focus on providing feedback while the children are also being taken care of? So there's a lot of factors that play into how we can do this efficiently while receiving feedback that we need, while also making sure that we are making it easy for our community to do so.
That's great. And actually you prompted one of the questions in our chat, which was around how do you bring non-technical public stakeholders up to speed and also create the conditions for them to constructively participate in algorithmic design. I don't know if other folks want to chime in here in terms of things that you've done to bring non-technical public stakeholders up to speed.
I can chime in on that, actually. So one of the big challenges that we had at the Census Bureau is kind of historically decisions about kind of how you implement your statistical safeguards for confidentiality have been made kind of behind closed doors. They've been made internally. And we actually benefited substantially from the public engagement this go around. we have incredibly talented demographers and economists and statisticians inside, but they don't know the full spectrum of uses of our data or how people on the ground are using these. And so they can't kind of inform a lot of that decision making without kind of information from the public. And being able to crowdsource this to state demographers and city planners and tribal leaders and public health professionals gave us this wealth of information to improve the design and implementation of our algorithms. But these were conversations that almost none of these stakeholder groups had any experience participating in before. Because as I said, historically, these are the types of things that have happened inside the agency. And so what we had to do was, in addition to trying to set up communication pathways with a very diverse set of stakeholders, we also had to really invest in a lot of education and information sharing outwards to those stakeholder groups so that they understood kind of what the design of our algorithm even was, so that they understood this trade-off that had to come into play between privacy and confidentiality. And so there was a huge educational component for us. And that was a challenge. Like we had a few missteps, certainly at the beginning of the process, but we kind of iterated and asked for feedback, not just on our algorithm design, but also asked for feedback on the materials that we were giving from that educational component, and use that feedback to then help kind of better design the information we had to put out to bring these non-technical stakeholders kind of at least up to the level where they can be constructively contributing to the conversation.
Thank you. And one of the questions in the chat is around the very concept of participatory design in AI, and wanted to know, maybe Chelsea or Emily, do you have thoughts on how the concept of participatory design and algorithms emerged, or when did it first start to come across your radar?
Well, I think participatory design in emerging technology has been around for a while, at least in the smart cities field. We've seen a really big push, especially after the Sidewalk Labs case study in K-Side, where there was a lack of communication about the use of residents' data for analyzing and generating efficiencies and optimization of different types of technologies in a smart city framework. I think we saw a really big push for integrating public perspective more and more across emerging technology. So my view is that the conversation isn't so different from with AI than from other types of technologies, but we have seen some great examples of cities that have integrated public perspective in a really informed way really well. One example I love pointing to is Paris instituted civic assemblies, in which they basically create an education opportunity for residents to become experts in a particular field or a particular technology, and they compensate them to provide their lived experience insight over a certain period of time to shape policy around that technology. And then at the end of that process, they receive a credential. And that credential, in some cases, residents report using that to gain their own professional opportunities elsewhere. So I think that's a great example of integrating, what we need from residents, which is their lived experience and understanding, so we can write policy or build a better service, but also treat that as, something that deserves to be compensated, and that in exchange for their time, they can receive a professional development opportunity in the process. And I think that can be applied across the board of different technologies, including AI.
Love this concept of the civic assemblies, particularly in providing input in technological issues. Erin or Emily, I'm curious, how do you budget for participatory design activities? How do this, or sorry, for Chelsea or Erin, how do you budget currently? How are you thinking about budgeting in the future?
I'll go ahead. Sorry, Chelsea. I wasn't sure if you were going first. We just make sure it's part of the overall budget for the initiative, right? And so if we're not willing to if those costs are too much, then I guess the whole thing is too much, right? So we just see it as a core part of the effort, and without which we would not be able to implement the effort for real. So it is, it's government funding primarily that we use to fund our initiatives.
It's similar for the city of San Jose. A lot of technology is tied to city services are already implemented. So for the city of San Jose, as we look into increasing our San Jose 311 services and looking at using AI to check road conditions, that's in a way partnered with the DOT and how we help their services fixing the roads. However, what's pretty new for the city of San Jose is actually my job in general. I only started 4 months ago, and I was hired as the public information officer for IT, which is the first of its kind to really, well, most other departments already have public information officers to promote their services. As IT saw the need to promote technology even before that tech is implemented into city services, to really start off with that engagement even before city services are even brought up into the conversation. So really promoting the idea of having someone dedicated to doing public outreach is something that's really important, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Love that pioneering spirit of bringing a public engagement professional like yourself to the IT team. Another question around how do you find public stakeholders? Do you piggyback onto existing public engagements, or do you start from scratch? And anyone who would like to chime in, please feel free.
I'll start. So we have kind of a well-established stakeholder engagement pathways. We have our federal advisory committees. We have various formal and informal stakeholder groups. We do formal consultations with tribal nations. But we also have a fairly flexible ability to kind of do more targeted engagement when we need to. And so we started with our kind of formal mechanisms, and then branched out as we were hearing, like, oh, we're missing segments of the community over here, we're missing segments over there. And again, this was an iterative process. So as we were hearing from groups that were not kind of represented in our ongoing fora, we would kind of establish new mechanisms for communicating with them. And it was very much an evolving process over a number of years, but ended up being a fairly effective one.
Yeah, I'll add, I mean, we do similar things. Of course, we have traditional stakeholders who are part of advisory committees and things like that. And then definitely do specific outreach to people most impacted by whatever we're doing. I think the other, I said this before, but other two really important things to do is to seek feedback from the people, especially advocates who you think will have the most concerns. So, ACLU of Pittsburgh engaged very early on in the Hello Baby initiative and other similar approaches we've taken. And then again, I think like it's not fun, it's super hard, but I think the big public meeting is still, even though we can target more easily now, and tech can help us to do that, is still a thing that is necessary to put yourself through as a public official trying to do something important.
Thank you for encouraging folks to be brave. With that, I want to thank all of our presenters, and I'm going to pass it on over to Jen for our panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And thanks to all our presenters on the last session. There's never enough time to get to all the questions, never enough time to unpack all the experiences, but we really appreciate that. those fantastic examples. I'm very pleased to move us into this next section, which is a plenary discussion with a wide range of experts and academics on lessons and emerging norms in this space. I'm thrilled to be joined by an outstanding panel, including Dr. Sheena Arete, who is Associate Professor at the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. Sheena is a researcher, educator, designer, and community advocate whose research has focused on co-designing socio-cultural technologies, practices, and policies with community residents to amplify their local efforts in addressing issues such as violence, education, civic engagement, and health. The objective of her work is to create more just and equitable outcomes and futures for those who have historically and who are currently facing structural oppression. Zoe Kahn is joining us from the UC Berkeley School of Information, where she is a PhD candidate and whose work uses qualitative methods to understand the perspectives and experiences of impacted communities and storytelling to influence the design of technical systems and the policies that surround their use. She has conducted empirical studies in rural villages in Togo, rural ranching communities in the United States, and with people experiencing homelessness in the Bay Area. We're also joined by Ming-Kyung Lee, who is an assistant professor in the School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. Min has conducted some of the first studies that empirically examine the social implication of algorithms' emerging roles in management and governance in society, looking at the impacts of algorithmic management on workers, as well as public perceptions of algorithmic fairness. She has also proposed a participatory framework that empowers community members to design matching algorithms for their own communities. We are also joined by Devansh Saxena, who is a presidential postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Mellon University in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, where he studies socio-technical practices of decision-making in the public sector and examines how human-AI interaction plays out in practice, where decisions are mediated by policies, nuances of professional practice, and algorithmic decision-making. And finally, we are joined by Tim Hughes, who is the Democracy and Participation Lead at the Open Government Partnership, and where he leads on deepening OGP's work around strengthening and reimagining democracy through open government, and especially through innovative approaches to participation and digital governance. So welcome to all of you. I'm thrilled to have you join this session. And if I can make sure that everyone's videos are on, please, I'd like to invite all our panelists to turn their videos on. Fantastic. Let's jump right into it. You all represent a wide diversity of academic institutions and expertise across the United States and globally. I'm wondering what norms we are seeing emerging in this space around open and participatory algorithmic design, and in particular, what lessons we are starting to glean. So Sheena, I'd like to turn to you first, if you don't mind sharing with us what your thoughts are on what we're seeing coming out of this space.
Yeah, so there are several things that have been emerging as norms. First, there have been extensive chatter about obviously inclusion and diversity. We've talked a lot about transparency and how do we make algorithms more open and explainable to the public. We've talked a lot about ethics and public engagement. And so this leads me to think about these questions about who's at the table when we're engaging in algorithmic design. And so as we're engaging in participatory design of algorithms, who are we engaging in? Can they attend, and what's the process and all of that? And so for the residents that are attending, I also always try to pose the question about who's not there and why aren't they there? And so we really have to think about, as we're bringing everyone to the table, even a deeper beyond the diversity and inclusion of like the participants who are helping us engage even at the beginning, but also the diversity and inclusion, and how does that reflect on the teams that are actually building the design of these technologies. And so the question is like, do they actually represent the diversity of the communities and the neighborhoods that are impacted by these algorithms? And so I'll give you an example. For example, I worked with street outreach workers in the city of Chicago, across the city, and we really engaged very, very deeply. And it took extensive amount of time to build trust in the street outreach work and the violence prevention work that they were doing on the ground. And this was much, much earlier than ChatGPT. So, algorithms and AI is not as common, et cetera. And so the question is and so we worked with those street outreach workers to design tools that they could use on a daily basis. And the other question is that came up is, how are we engaging them in meaningful ways? Meaning, can they hold us accountable? And so I think even as we think about local governments creating these technologies, are there mechanisms to try to hold us accountable to that? And so and then the last thing I think I would want to say is, if we're engaging in and we're trying to create means for them to be accountable, how are we thinking about issues around power, and how are we shifting power such that the communities own their own data and are part of the processes, not just at the point where we are creating the tools, but also all throughout the design, evaluation, and deployment of the algorithms. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for those comments, Sheena. That issue of local empowerment, going beyond just the inclusion, but really using these tools to empower communities is such a part of what I think we'll hear, especially some of our global comparative experiences, what we're hearing on that stage. Min, I wonder if you might come in on this as well, because I know your research has focused on this nexus point.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk about some of the benefits of participation in AI design. So the speakers in the first case study session, they gave presentation on excellent cases where they included community members from the get-go and how they actually improved and redesigned the AI system, and which kind of earned their trust and kind of made the system to actually fit their local culture, etc. So that was an excellent example. I also wanted to highlight that the participation itself can actually give really good ideas on what to build, and not just how, but what to build to address their actual needs. So one example that I like to use is the work that we did with gig workers. Initially, we were doing interviews with them to understand the pain point. And our original thought was, okay, as a researcher designer, we are going to think about how to address their needs. But actually, when we were engaging with them, they were giving us a lot of good ideas on how they want to benefit from their own data, what are analytics that they want to see in their dashboard, etc. So we quickly kind of reframe our studies to think about how can we actually co-design the initial conceptual idea itself with through the worker participation and involvement. So I think one benefit of the participation is that they actually have great ideas on what to build and how to build. I also wanted to highlight some benefits that we saw on participants themselves. So participation is a laborious process, so I'm very grateful for their participation, but also it was very meaningful to see that the participation itself had an effect on them, positive effect on them. Like, for example, a lot of people use this occasion as a way to learn about AI. So in some of the early work we did, some participants expressed their skepticism that AI can do, for example, allocation work, because for them, allocation for nonprofit donation work, it's work that involves care. And they thought that it was strategically human work, but when they're actually doing it and saw how AI can be trained on their own data, etc., they started to say that, I actually think the AI can do this work. And then their perceived barrier in thinking of AI got a lot lower. The other kind of benefit that we saw is because they themselves have to think about their own work routine or the service, etc., it gave them an opportunity to reflect on their own work and practice. So a lot of people, when they're leaving the study, they said, I kind of learned about my work, and now I'm going to talk to my manager to talk about this point. So that was also kind of, I think when we are thinking about participation, we should really think about intentionally how to promote this positive impact on the participants. And the last thing that I'll briefly touch is that because when we think of algorithm design, because of AI, the importance of new method and tools also is important, and there is a lot of room for innovation for them to give input on this. they can range from storyboards and comic board techniques to more tech-driven approach where we build a tool where they can easily train machine learning model for themselves. So kind of another third lesson is like we need to think about the new method.
Thanks for those excellent points, Min, and really hands-on, everything from how we are communicating and participating in accessible ways, in open ways, but also understanding that this is a two-way street. There's clear benefits to governments from this participation and from officials. Devansh, I wonder if you might come in on this because particularly on that point about how it changes participants. I know you've done some interesting research from the employee side. So I wonder if you might come in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to first piggyback off of Min's point about how citizens can help us not just question the technology that we are talking about, but also help us design the right things. So citizen engagement often occurs after a system has been developed, and here the goal is often to make the system more ethical or community-centered. But in my recent work, what we are learning is that citizens can play a critical role during the very first step of the AI lifecycle. That is when the data scientists take a social problem and convert it into a measurable statistical problem. We generally call that problem formulation. And this is where a lot of the fairness issues become embedded that are significantly hard to fix at later stages. And so what we're doing is building simple sandboxes for community members to engage with. This kind of builds off of something that Emily was talking about earlier. And we are learning that community members are able to really question the core objective of the tool itself, the data that it's using, and also how the system is being used. And finally, these sandboxes also help create an informed mistrust, showing community members all the ways in which the AI system fails. And so, for instance, we built a simple AI crime mapping tool that was based on the city that the participants live in. And from the get-go, that helped establish a degree of comfort because they knew the city, they knew the neighborhoods, and so from the get-go, community members questioned whether allocating more patrol cars actually helped protect the community. So the goal of the tool was misaligned with what the community wanted in the first place. They also talked about a cycle of over-policing. You send more patrol cars to some neighborhoods, you find more crime, and then you end up sending more patrol cars to those neighborhoods. And then they also highlighted that arrests do not really equal the likelihood for crime, because an arrest does not really mean a person is guilty. And based on your zip code, your likelihood for crime, your likelihood of getting arrested can be very high. So what we saw was from the get-go, just at the very first stage of the AI lifecycle, community members are really able to question the primary goal of the tool, what kind of data is being used, and the downstream impact that it can have on their own communities. So that was the community perspective on this. I've also worked extensively with workers to understand their perspectives on these tools and how they engage with them. And what we often end up finding is that workers have very good mental models of how their work actually goes on and where these tools come in. And if the tool is not centered in their nature of practice, helps them accomplish their work in some ways, they end up finding ways to work around it or gaming the system. And they will socially learn from other workers on how to do this. And so a lot of my work is in child welfare, and we see that child welfare workers will continually find ways to game AI systems to make them work for their clients, the families, and not just to meet the demands of the policymakers.
Thanks so much, Devansh. And that's just such an interesting connection between both sort of the design elements around being intentional and what communities need and the stakeholders sort of that it's fit for purpose in your earlier point, and then the folks who have to actually implement it. So you've done some comparative pieces, and I know we'll hear from Tim in just a moment too about other comparative experiences, but what are some norms and emerging lessons you've focused in on?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really such an honor to be here with all of you. What I want to suggest is that to do participatory algorithm design well requires really thinking thoughtfully about how to elicit and integrate insights from people with different types of expertise And this really includes everyday people who are sometimes referred to as maybe experiential experts, as well as people with domain expertise, people like data scientists or privacy scholars or policymakers and so forth. And I know that this is a panel on algorithms, but I actually want us to spend a minute to just think about airplane design, because I think it provides us with a really useful analogy here. So let's imagine that we wanted to design an airplane that was safe, but also really comfortable for passengers. We would need lots of different types of experts, right? We would need mechanical engineers to help us build the engine. We need aerospace engineers to make sure that the plane's aerodynamic. And we would also need experiential experts or passengers to make sure that the plane is really comfortable. And it would be really important that each expert is providing input on the aspect that really aligns with their expertise, right? We would want a mechanical engineer to weigh in on the engine, but not necessarily the design of the body. And we would really want passengers to weigh in on the comfort of the airplane as opposed to how the engine should be designed. And similarly, we might need, let's say, human factors experts to provide input on the ergonomics of chairs, but we shouldn't confuse human factors experts with the passengers themselves. And I think that we're beginning to learn that something is true in the space of algorithm design. We need privacy scholars to help us identify technical vulnerabilities. We need data scientists to help us build models. And we really need everyday people to help us understand what will happen when the technology is situated within their everyday lives. And no single expert is going to be sufficient. I think we've seen this in many of the case studies earlier today, all of the different types of expertise and the critical role that everyday people have in helping us situate the technology in everyday life. And part of what I find appealing about this framing around expertise is that I think it treats people with dignity, and it also provides a mechanism for accountability. No one kind of expert is more important than another. They are all important and they all need to come together. And in the same way that we are accountable to addressing a security vulnerability that's identified by a security expert, so too we're accountable to addressing a harm that's surfaced by an experiential expert. So just to kind of quickly recap here, I think that in order to do this well, it really requires thinking about expertise. Expertise matters, and we need different types of experts to help us understand different aspects of the situation and help us think through solutions.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for bringing it back to that very sort of human-centered experiential piece that I think is so critical that a number of our other panelists have also touched on, including some of what Sheena was mentioning in terms of who's not at the table. Tim, I'd like to turn it to you for the last comments on this. Obviously, for those that don't know, OGP as a global platform is working with over 75 countries around the world and almost 200 local governments on open government, including digital governance and this emerging space of AI and what that means for open government and what it means for participation. So Tim, I might put you on the spot to share a few global examples if you might.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. I'm really pleased to be here. So yes, as you say, this is one of, if not the fastest growing policy areas that OGP is working on. We've seen a vast number of commitments made through the OGP platform over recent years around issues to do with automated decision-making and some algorithmic transparency and participation as well. I think 33 in total since 2018 from different countries. I think it's interesting to see how those have developed over time. So the first round of reforms were very much focused more around the algorithmic transparency side of things. So we had countries like Canada and Netherlands committing to conducting impact assessments around automated decision making and also making algorithms openly available as well. Similarly, Scotland committed to developing a public register of AI algorithms, and New Zealand committed to implementing an algorithm charter, which helped to kind of define the kind of accountability around the use of algorithms. But I think what's interesting is more recently the conversation has turned much more towards the participatory side of things, and we've seen The UK, for example, holding deliberative processes around what well, meaningful transparency means in algorithmic decision making, and using that to define an algorithmic transparency standard. But we're also seeing a lot more leadership as well from the global south of late on some of these issues. So Chile is probably the world leader in terms of its public participation around its AI strategy. Involved over 8,000 people in policy discussions using a range of different methods to develop its AI strategy. Uruguay has committed to creating a multi-stakeholder oversight body of the government's use of artificial intelligence. And Kenya is has recently committed to promoting ethical, safe, inclusive, and responsible and human rights-centered digital transformation, including through using multi-stakeholder coordination mechanisms. So I think as the last speaker was saying, this kind of focus on taking a multi-stakeholder approach is something that's really coming to the fore at the moment. Lots of interest in different methods that brings together those different sources of expertise, along with the expertise that the public themselves can offer on these issues as well. I think one of the learnings that's come out of these different phases is that the public really needs to be involved from the very early stages, as others have said, and involved very much in those upstream problem definition conversations, as much as kind of reviewing the specific kind of use cases for algorithms as well. So lots of activity around the world on this at the moment. And yeah, I'll leave it there and back to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Well, I loved the way that we really brought together a few themes here on sort of intentional design, bringing stakeholders and the public and communities intentionally into the design to ensure it's fit for purpose, to ensure it's informed by experience around the transparency elements, and really that civic engagement, that trust building that we heard too from the case studies earlier. And then a few mentioned this issue of accountability for who's there and who's not there, but also accountability for how these algorithms are being used. So I think we pulled out some really important emerging norms here. I'd like to turn to a second question for all of you, which I'll ask you to briefly reply to, which is really what the challenges and barriers are in this space. So Sheena, let's start with you again, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I would start with there's this huge, I mean, we all talk about this knowledge gap, and it's come up several times in the previous conversation. And while most of us kind of discuss this knowledge gap as this lack of understanding that community residents might have, but instead, there's also in terms of like the lack of knowledge or know-how from technologists, from local governments on how to meaningfully engage and gather insight, and then use that insight throughout the life cycle. And so we are just learning processes. And so I think that it's really, I think we've all talked about local communities and local organizations and the expertise that they hold. But I think that there's this huge knowledge gaps that we have. And so we must kind of create these processes and frameworks that not only focus on working with communities and gathering it, but also how to build trust in a meaningful way, how to shift power, how to center communities in the design of technologies, and able to do that and scale it. I think the second thing is Emily mentioned is procurement, which is everybody's favorite topic, right? Everybody loves procurement. Not really, but I'm just, but what are the policies and contracts in place so we can hold tech companies accountable for meaningfully engaging in the creation of these technologies? And so procurement and contracting is something that is a huge challenge, and we have to think about that so that we can have tech companies really engage with those who have non-dominant voices in the development of these types of technologies. And the last one I would say is like shifting power, and shifting power is really, really difficult. And there are so many opportunities for a breakdown in the shift of power. And so we have to think about that, which is like the communities that we work with. How do we gather this information? And how do we think about, for them, how do they set the context in which they want these algorithms to be used? And so how do we make sure that not only are we hearing them, but they're engaging in meaningful ways? I'm gonna stop there.
Thanks so much, Sheena. Those really succinct points and really on point. Min, over to you.
Yeah, it was great to hear Sheena's answer, because I think we have exactly same point. I can go a little bit more details on maybe like why thinking about good quality participation and defining is a challenge. And there are so many open questions. There are like 3 dimensions that participatory governance usually talk about, like how we select the participants, like whom to engage, what and also how many and what is a good sample that's representative of all different populations. We don't have a good answers for that yet. And also the other dimension is communication and decision. So what kind of input we are getting? Is it just individual preferences, or the participant play a role in aggregating the preference and potentially even resolving conflicts? Because we all know that different stakeholders have different goals and conflicting priorities. And the last point is what Sheena mentioned is power. Like, what will be their role? Are they just influencing the government agency or developers, or are they consult, or are they going to be co-governors? So kind of deciding how much power should be given the participant is another open question. And going back to the analogy of airplane that Joey mentioned, this will actually depend on different contexts. Like airplane is different from cars, from homes and roads. So kind of thinking, and AI can play a very different roles. And so we will need to have a good ideas on how these different decisions should be made for these different AI applications.
Thanks so much, and also for extending the metaphor. Devansh?
Hi, yeah, both Sheena and Men made great points. A lot of the participatory work we do right now is very event-based. We organize workshops, we organize big meetings and bring in community members. But to really do good participatory design, we need to find ways to do more continuous longitudinal engagement with community members and create space to do that. And I think that is just definitely a big challenge over there. And how do we accomplish that?
Yeah, great point on the meaningfulness and the authenticity of the engagement. Zoe, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just building on so much of what's already been said. I think I want to highlight what I see as sort of 3 interesting opportunities. And I think the first really builds on what Sheena was mentioning, which is, and what I've been kind of thinking about is how do we identify questions that really leverage each expert's unique perspectives? And again, sort of going back to this airplane analogy, of course, I think Min's point that airplanes are not the same as algorithms, I think is really important. And I think we should be thinking about how and why and what those differences are. But I do think it's useful. And I think it's useful in part because we, if we were thinking about engaging passengers, we would be mistaken to engage passengers on how the engine should be designed, instead of thinking about what they're really experts in, which is talking about all of the things that they need in order to feel really comfortable and safe and secure on an airplane. And I think that in some ways, the same can be said to be true for algorithms. I think Erin provided a really interesting example of her experience around sort of the questions to engage the public and versus sort of engaging them on like the technical details necessarily. And I think similarly in my own research in Togo, I just wanted to share a story of where I kind of initially got this wrong. So I was doing research in rural Togo, which is in West Africa. And I wanted to understand local perspectives on data privacy related to mobile phone data. And initially I asked questions that are sort of often asked in participatory workshops, like what concerns would you have about this data being collected and used? And I was really met with blank stares. And realizing I was asking the wrong questions, I then pivoted and began asking questions that made the links between the data and their lives more explicit. So how would they feel if this data were revealed to people in their community, in their household, or to the government? And people had lots to say on this question. And so this was a really quick way that I learned that the questions that we ask of these different experts, I think really does matter. And then the second point I wanted to make is, I think we need to consider what experiential experts need to understand about a technical system in order to provide meaningful input. And I'd like to suggest that in some cases, they don't need any technical details. And in other cases, they may need to know something really specific. They might need to know something specific about the data, the target variable, the interface design, how different databases are connected. And to do so in a way that's really accessible may require creative strategies. We've heard a couple of examples, and I just wanted to share some from my research in Togo around explaining mobile phone data to people in ways that use these really culturally relevant and visuals, really simple visuals, to explain the data that's recorded and not recorded in mobile phone data. And then finally, just very briefly, taking a step back and similar to what Sheena and Min have mentioned, I think this raises a really important challenge, which is who decides? Who decides which experts participate? Who decides the questions that each expert is well suited to weigh in on? Who decides what mental models we give people? These are really important questions, and they're all wrapped up in this question of power that I think Sheena really importantly pointed us to at the start.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Great points, and I really love your examples. Tim, we just have about 30 seconds for you to give us a top line on what a challenge is from the global perspective.
Sure. Well, I think one that's been covered very well so far is the skills capacity to engage the public in terms of kind of institutional capacity to do that. And I think we see some kind of interesting case studies and innovations here and there, but we need to make that much more mainstream, embed those capacities much more across all different levels of governments to make sure that this is much more commonplace, because that's really what's needed to build trust.
Thank you so much. So we heard it right here. We need to do more on participatory design, unpacking it, understanding it, making it meaningful, giving people information that they need to engage, ensuring that we have power shifting in mind. So thank you so much to all of our experts here for all these wonderful observations and for tying it back to the real life examples we have. So I really appreciate you joining us today. And with that, I'd like to shift us to the very last part of this, last but not least. We are very pleased to have Deirdre Mulligan, who serves as the Principal Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer here at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, to join us for some final remarks. Over to you, Deirdre. I'd like to especially thank all our many panelists who joined us today. Thank you for those who have remained on for the remainder of the session. And also want to especially thank our partners at the General Services Administration, at the U.S. Open Government Secretariat for all the back end, the webinar, and for all of you for participating. I'm going to hand this over to Dan York to officially close us out. Thank you.
No, thank you. And again, I would join the chorus of thank yous to our fantastic panelists and speakers. I'd like to remind everyone that this event will be posted on open.usa.gov within the next week or so, as well as the notes documents of what was talked about and the slide presentations themselves. I'd like to invite our participants to consider joining the U.S. Tech Policy Network and Open Government listservs so you can stay up to date on what's going on, as well as our new soon to be released new webpage. So there's a lot going on in future events as we continue to engage with the Open Government Partnership. Thank you all again, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon, evening.